Hello everyone, and welcome again to Making the Rounds. I am here with just Emily today. She is my wildcard expert because I'm just prefacing it saying before the play-in, I had watched Zero Lion, I'd watched some Team 1, I'd watched Zero Lion, I'd watched Zero Gambit, and I'd watched Zero Direwolves before the start of the series. Don't tell the LPL casters that I don't watch Direwolves because they'll be very sad about it. But the point is that Emily is going to mostly deal with the wildcard questions that I have in terms of like what they were like leading up. And then after that, we're going to just kind of break down by Group A, Group B, what we think of them. And depending on whether or not I feel like we're going to upload this video today, we'll talk about the other two groups beforehand. So, first question, since we're going to start with Group A, I feel like this group was the one with the more surprising results since everyone thought that Team 1 and Direwolves were pretty close. I wanted to ask you, like, were you surprised as a few people were, by the fact that Lyon made it out over Gambit?
So I think this is a surprise, but I don't think it's like this. A lot of people are saying this is like a gigantic upset. And I actually don't think it is. The reason why, catching up on Lyon and Gambit going into this tournament, Lyon looked very similar to how they've looked for the past about, I'd say, year or so, where they kind of, when people really started noticing them, it was after they had picked up White Lotus, and they made a lot of noise at the international qualifier last year for the World Championship. They had a really good group performance. They had very strong laning performances. They had a really great early game. They just picked for strong lanes. That's the kind of team that they were. But once they got into trouble in the mid game, that's where they really had issues, right? Like they didn't necessarily know how to transition those advantages to into success. And that is where, so that's why going into this group stage, I was still concerned that Lyon would be doing that exact same thing, because I didn't see anything in their performances leading up, and maybe this is on me, maybe I just didn't see it. They still looked really strong within their region, but I think I was still very concerned that they wouldn't be able to take those early advantages that they tend to have, take those laning advantages, and really turn it into wins. And obviously, they proved me wrong, and I'm actually really happy because I've been watching this team, pretty much the same roster since last year, and it's really cool to watch them succeed and figure that stuff out and figure out how to use those early advantages well into the mid game. I think on the side of Gambit, one thing that was really interesting about Gambit is they had a lot of really cool ideas and setups around objectives, especially like some of their Barons in the final, in the CIS final, was really interesting. But their execution wasn't always there. And when I was comparing these two teams, I still thought that because Gambit seemed to know how to set up around objectives a little bit better, that they would still be able to outperform Lyon, just because, again, I still didn't see Lyon having that ability to transition from early game advantages to mid to late. And they proved me wrong. I thought, in particular, like, I'm probably going to go right about it, actually, but in particular, I thought Adi had a great tournament, or has had a great tournament so far. And it's just really cool to see this team perform well. So I'm happy. I don't think it's as large of an upset as people are saying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the specific teams, I think that I was sort of impressed with the way in which I was actually more impressed with Lyon's objective setup to an extent. And by that I mean they actually had kind of this clever setup in, I think it was the last game that they played against Gambit, where they had an idea of how to play 1-3-1 that was a little bit creative, which was to just use shallow wards, and they were on blue side, just to use shallow wards on the red side, red buff jungle entrance, and then kind of keep their 3 off to the side, and they could do this because they were basically just against Jhin and Ali, and they could keep their 3 off to the side while their side lanes were pushing, so that like the enemy team couldn't really force on their mid, and couldn't necessarily react well to the side lane because they didn't know where Lion's 3 was short of this. So I actually thought that they had a lot better setups in some situations than Gambit did. I felt like Gambit were just really, really lost, and obviously I can't speak to how they were in the regular season for them or in their playoffs because I didn't watch them, but I'm kind of curious, did you feel like they were more messed up than usual, or?
I think that a lot of those execution errors that I talked about previously when I was looking at them going into this tournament definitely came to a head in terms of their setup might be good, but then the actual execution was lacking. And then a lot of times I feel like teams, this is going to be weird to say because it's really difficult to compare regions, right? Because Lyon has been kind of at the top of their region for a while. It's been difficult for me to evaluate how well they've progressed. And similarly with Gambit, I think Gambit also benefited from the fact that typically outside of top lane, their lanes were usually winning. And when that didn't happen, I think they had a lot of issues adjusting to that, and that's when their setup also failed. Another thing that I do have to point out that I think I touched on this briefly going into the tournament, and I know I think Peter wrote about it in his Group A preview.
Peter Dunn,
for
the
ESPN.
INTZ coach, just to clarify.
Former INTZ coach. Their top lane was going to be with PvP Stayhost was going to be the weakest in terms of like mechanical matchups. And I also do think we saw teams kind of identifying that and picking on their top lane a bit. So I think that was also something that it's hard to gauge because it definitely depends on the strengths of their opponents within their own regions. And I think that Gambit definitely benefited from the fact that they typically won early, from what I saw. Now, someone who knows like CIS and studied it better would probably be able to speak to that a little bit more because I only watched their like playoffs going in. So, but I think that was something that came to a head here is when they found themselves behind early, or if they did make a mistake early and then lost a lot of their momentum, they didn't really know how to continue and have those objective setups that they'd had within CIS.
I mean, for me, another big thing was just that their drafts were honestly god-awful. They had this tendency to just give up, I guess, god compositions. So it wasn't just that they would, like, draft a couple of losing lanes or something here and there. It was just that holistically, you would look at the composition that the enemy team was building, and you'd know, okay, they have to ban this because if they get this, then they have a god comp. And it was just like, okay, well, the enemy team now has Camille, Jarvan, Galio, Tristana. Like, all of this stuff together, like, independently is really good on its own, but then together you just, like, what are you going to do against that? And then, of course, like, against WE, they gave up, like, Janna, Gragas, Shen, Tristana, just, like, all of these really, really strong, holistic compositions. And then, also, they would just make mistakes early that would cause them to end up losing lanes as well. And so there just was very limited options, and then they made poor side trades. They actually, against WE, the first day, I actually thought that they had a fairly smart approach in terms of, like, they did the thing that I think you should do against WE, which is kind of lane swap And then from there, though, they didn't keep pressure top very well. They had already given up double kill bot anyway by the time they swapped. And then, so they swapped back for Dragon, which was good. And they actually were ahead of WE in tempo here. And then they forced Rift Herald a little bit too hard, I think, was a problem that they had. But I think if you get Rift Herald against WE and you get a good lane swap against WE and you take down their mid, then you take down their ability to get a lot of pressure for invades and play around bot and play around bot dragon fights. So I liked that they were thinking about that kind of thing. But to me it was just that Gambit had so many problems that, I don't know, it's very difficult for me to imagine that these problems just suddenly appeared, but I have no idea.
No, I mean, I don't think they did. I think one of the reasons that I was putting Gambit over Lyon is, again, because I didn't see a lot. Like, I've always known since last year that Audi could have these really strong, like, early games where he is really smart about his pathing. And we saw that especially when he went up against Condi's jungle Ezreal. I thought a lot of the stuff he did was, like, really smart, and it's worth calling out.
Sure, yeah. I guess there were a couple of things. I think the Kha'Zix pick was smart. I just, like, the reason I made the face is I'm remembering the, like, early invade that was just against the Galio push, and I was just like, do we give Audi credit for that? But yeah, there were a couple of other, like, camp denials and stuff that were good, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's one of the, there's another series I was thinking about in NA that was really similar, where it's like, do we give CLG credit for having a really strong early pathing, or do we give Dignitas credit for weird invades? But I think it's a mixture of both. But I do think, like, Audi is a fairly smart jungler early, and he always has been, and they've always had these strong lanes. And for me, it was that I just didn't, so, like, they have always had issues with mid-game transitions, always. Like, they've lost so many games with early leads at, like, when I've seen them in international competition. And I didn't see anything leading up to this tournament that made me think that they might be able to change that. But again, like I said, I'm happy to be proven wrong. For Gambit, I also think that a lot of their weaknesses were visible in CIS. And that's one thing that's really hard with a lot of these minor region teams coming in, is a lot of times they will be benefiting from, and I'm sure we'll talk about this again when we talk about Group B and if we preview other groups, a lot of the time they benefit from having really strong lanes anyway, just because they might have a few better players and they'll draft for, like, early laning pushes. And that's not a bad thing, but I'm saying that once you get to a level where everyone is going to be equally or more mechanically skilled, it's then difficult because you're not going to be able to get away with a lot of those things against other teams. And I think we saw that Lyon really was able to recognize where they were strong, and was also able to capitalize on that when they could.
Yeah,
so
I mean, I think that's fair to an extent. They still made some mistakes, like they didn't necessarily have to play towards top, I think, in the final game against Gambit. Like, that was really on Gambit to snowball top, and then they would have been probably better off bottom, but I understand what you mean. Like, they know where they're strong. I also think they thought about their opponents better, probably. I talked to Peter about this after the first Lyon Gambit game, because he was really high on the fact that they ganked bottom early and prevented Edward from roaming. And I didn't necessarily see why that was so valuable, because I hadn't studied Gambit, and Gambit still had top priority and still had the ability to roam mid and control mid lane that way. So I felt like that didn't completely shut down Gambit's win condition, but apparently that was the better decision to make, because when they did try to use that pressure, they misexecuted that, lost flash, and then the top laner, like Stehos, went back top and got really punished for not having a flash in lane. So I think that, yeah, that was probably a good call in terms of it's good to play to this bot side, even if bot is going to be fine on its own in this particular matchup. So. Anyway, any final words on, I guess, Gambit then?
I mean, I guess it's sad to not see them perform as well as like I thought, but I'm also happy for Lyon. I mean, it's one of those weird things where when I study these teams, especially the minor region teams, I kind of want all of them to be successful somehow. But Gambit, I mean, it's a really rough showing for them, especially given the expectations for them going in. So,
and I don't want to be too harsh on them. I felt like they were really lost in terms of what they should do with their comps, in terms of how to draft. But like, I think Kira, for example, performed really well individually. Like, I was surprised by how well Kira played certain matchups. So, I mean, he wasn't like a superstar or anything, but I think that this is still overall like decent players, a good setup. They just could benefit a lot from guidance of some kind, or macro knowledge.
yeah.
Period. Like, don't super hard trade for bot T1 and when Baron is up. I don't know, things like this. Seems simple, but could be helpful to them in the future. Anyway, so Gambit no longer at the tournament, but the one team in Group A we haven't talked that much about is WE. How do you kind of feel about WE after you watched group stage games going into the next round?
Ugh. Not confident, that's for sure. I don't know. I haven't really been impressed with them at this tournament thus far. I've seen this team have the capability and wherewithal to be able to take both Lyon and Gambit and like actually do really well. So I don't know why. I guess I'm wondering why that didn't happen. They had a lot of really weird decision making early, that cost them a lot. I think, I don't know. Like,
I mean, I was overall not that surprised by that. I feel like I was the only one not surprised that WE didn't just like smash the group, because like I've said, they have this tendency to do weird things early and be cocky, do cocky invades with Condi, or Mystic will play really cocky and they'll get picked off. So for me in general, I wasn't that surprised by that aspect at all, but what did show through, which is what WE are really good at, which is understanding like the next objective that they're going to play for it and setting up for that while they're setting up for this one. Like, I think in their very first game, it was really telling that even though they kept losing, getting picked off and doing these really dumb things, they would always get the objective for it, right? It's like, yeah, you should probably not be forcing this dragon here, but you got the dragon for a couple of deaths. I guess that's fine. The only problem is that you gave the kills to Kog'Maw. Like, things of that nature, it's really not unexpected for me to see. And I think it's not, like, this kind of play is also symptomatic of teams like Cloud9 or G2 Esports or TSM that don't have, like, that have focused much more on understanding objective priority in mid to late and setting up fights in mid to late than they do in like having super coordinated laning phases and things like that. So to me, it wasn't surprising to see them, especially if you're saying both Gambit and Lyon are much more early focused, and I feel like wildcard teams tend to be like that. It wasn't surprising to see this. I think they generally had decent drafts or decent understanding of where their strengths and weaknesses were. I was surprised, if anything, I was surprised that Shia played better than I thought he was going to play. Shia actually played pretty well. Yeah, I don't know. There are just a lot of weird WE moments, I guess, but
yeah, like they'd have like these really questionable either invades or ganks, or like they'd force skirmishes. I'm just like, what are you doing? And then they'd also have these other really cool moments, like the fight against, it was Gambit, right? Their first game against Gambit with Xie's Jace, where they had the, he was basically waiting in the brush, so after they took Dragon, he goes in with Shen ult, and the rest of the team collapsed. I thought some of their setups like that were really cool.
I mean, they're really good in a situation at juggling who's going to frontline, right? If someone gets low, they're good at trading them out and making sure someone else is the target, the enemy team, and just having that kind of coordination. And that's something that will always be good for WE. I think their Baron setups tend to be really smart. So
yeah, their Barons were good.
It was really telling that almost every time, like, someone would be ahead, WE would have the mid push, and so if someone went for Baron, WE would still have like vision advantage or something like this. And I think that was a really big advantage for them against wildcard teams, is that the Baron setups a lot of times were really questionable from Lyon and Gambit. So the fact that WE were almost always able to have top push, and then like there was even this one case where they are like, okay, if you guys want to Rift Herald bot side, you know, we know you're Rift Heralding bot side to try to pull us bot so that you can get Baron control and set up vision for Baron for you to take it later, but we're just not going to respond and take Baron then. Like, so that was fine. There were a couple of things like that were fine. I think Gambit had actually it was just like a lot of the team, Lyon and Gambit both got super desperate and went for weird Barons that W took advantage of. And I think that that's something that, yeah, they probably won't get away with in the main stage that much, but it's just kind of always been their sort of go-to. And with that, combined with the fact that, yeah, maybe their wave control isn't the best, but it's above average, I think is really useful for WE going forward. So, any thoughts on WE from you? Besides what I said, besides questionable invades?
Yeah, I mean, it's weird because when I'm thinking about who they might face in a best of 5, I still think it's going to be pretty difficult for WE to fall out completely from
like, we haven't seen the C and
groups,
D teams,
I guess, yeah.
For
D is going to be especially weird.
Yeah, I feel bad. I feel like it's really hard to gauge Fenerbahce because they're playing with a sub-jungle. And
that makes me really sad.
They have no scrims, effectively, right? So, yeah, it's a little bit sad because they were supposed to be one of the better teams. So, we'll see what Group C and D are like. I hear that KLG might be better than expected. So, that's cool. But overall, looking at the teams T1 and whatchamacallit, sorry, Direwolves, yeah, T1 and Direwolves that we saw play, and then what I've heard of the other teams, because I also haven't watched them, is that I shouldn't be too afraid for WE in a best of 5, especially since I think they're better suited to best of 5s than best of 1s.
That's what I was going to say. I think WE, considering, so, like, obviously they're not, like, I don't want people to take away from what I'm saying, that they're this, like, wait for late game, the Elder Drake team, right? Like, the Baron and Elder Drake team. But I do think that because of WE's tendency to, like, their stronger objective setup, later the game goes, their understanding of how to play the later the game goes, I think that in best of 5s against the teams that they'll presumably be facing, they should be able to make it out of play. And I think where we might have to worry about them is groups in best of 1s.
Yep.
I think that's where they actually will probably have a lot of trouble looking at them now. Like that group with TSM, like if they do make it out and they end up in the Group D with TSM, Misfits, and Flash Wolves, that's going to be a really interesting group because based on what WE have shown us, that is now pretty much toss-up, even though they do make that group tougher, obviously.
Yep. I still think that based on Misfits will make similar mistakes mid-late.
Yeah, that's been there.
Flash Wolves are really difficult to gauge right now. I think that they're going to be a little underestimated, but that's an issue. I'm not, like, TSM's final was really bizarre. It made them have like all their problems seemed much more exaggerated against Immortals. So I think that's gonna be an interesting one as well. But I do think I feel like my opinion of WE hasn't really changed. So whatever I said before, I'll continue to say. Anyway, let's move. What do you think? I mean, do you think that there are teams that Lyon can beat? Actually, upset.
Now looking at Lyon, I mean, the thing you really have to watch out is their early game, right? Mm-hmm. I still think having gone through how they've shored up some of these weaknesses mid-game, I still think they're going to have issues against a team. For example, like if they ended up playing Fnatic, I think they're going to have issues because I think Fnatic will know how to spread them on the map and especially take advantage of side lanes. Not that Lyon's side lanes aren't strong enough in the like 1v1 and 2v2, but that Fnatic just know how to play around and split pressure a lot better than what I've seen from Lyon still. I think a Lyon HKA matchup would be super interesting, actually. I'd like want to see that. That would be entertaining.
Yeah, I think
just because it's like these two teams that really rely on like having strong early laning and just like smashing into each other. I think that would be really interesting.
Godquai maybe worse than Forlan. I'm not really sure. It's kind of hard to say. He has a lot of questionable moves, but Forlan did not exactly. Forlan is an interesting guy. He's now my new favorite player, I think. Speaking of Forlan, let's move on to Group B, since we spent some time talking about Group A. I feel like you might be slightly more surprised that Team 1 made it out than that Lyon made it out. That's just my guess. What do you think?
So the Team 1 C9 games went about as I expected. I'd said previously that, because people are like, oh, I think they could upset C9 because they're known as like a strategic team, whereas C9 just, they're like, didn't look good in the qualifier. And I'm just like, no, like they just do not have, and that's what you saw, right? Like regardless of who was playing mid lane, although I like Marth in better than Bruiser. Regardless of who was in, they were vastly outclassed individually.
I feel like Marth has a better sense of map pressure based on the two games that I've seen of him than Bruiser. So I
mean, I've always liked Marth better. He was the mid laner that came up with Genesis. But whatever, that's like a team decision. I think so the C9 T1 games were not unexpected to me whatsoever. I expected both of those to be stomps. I really didn't think that Team 1 would be able to outsmart C9, especially since Team 1's thing, that like how they got here was basically taking advantage of teams that didn't make proactive moves, and they would basically make mistakes late, and then Team 1 would go and outplay them by playing for objectives. C9 is the type of team that, yes, maybe they still have issues being proactive early, but they still have way better mechanical players, and they also have a fairly good sense of how to play late game team fights, right? That's always kind of been their thing, like that they could fall back on. So those games went about as expected. The first Dire Wolves game, I was like, oh my god, what are Team 1 doing? Because they drafted all losing lanes in like a Jax jungle. It was high. So some of their drafts, or most of their drafts, are highly questionable. But I do think we saw like against a team like Dire Wolves where they're more evenly matched. The reason why Team 1 did end up coming out, and the reason why I had initially picked them to get out over Dire Wolves, despite the fact that Dire Wolves had more prep coming into this, they boot camped, was just because I still didn't see anything from Dire Wolves that made me think that they'd be able to play around jungle pressure and set up for objectives late as well as Team 1 did. Now, I'm not saying that Team 1 played particularly well either. Like, I think both of those games are pretty not great and not recommended to watch. But the last game, so the tiebreaker match, I was happy for Team 1 because I felt like they came out and they drafted something that was still strong for them, but also didn't sacrifice as much as they had previously in drafts, where again, like we talked about giving up the god comp. Well, Team 1 were really good at that. So I think obviously like the Forlan Olaf should not be a surprise to anyone who's watched this team. And I think they did a good job of drafting a composition that they could kind of showcase their team's strengths. So I'm glad for them. I don't see them winning a best of 5. I think they're vastly outclassed mechanically by a lot of teams at this tournament.
I wish I could just sit down with Forlan and be like,
and teach him how to
go over this game with him and say every time he makes a decision at all, just like anyone, why, you know? I think it was the first game where he played in Italy, where he goes red, blue, and then he like starts doing wolves and pass back top, and then he just walks all the way back bottom and tries to gank randomly and then every time I think to myself something like, okay, Forlan needs to, like in the Elise game, it's like Forlan needs to snowball these solo lanes in order for this game to work. It's like 20 minutes later, it's like, oh, there's a jungler in this game and he's dying. Okay, this is a good thing. This is fun.
And he had all those crazy invades with no vision where he just kept, like, someone was like, he was a walking ward, and I was like, yes, that's exactly it.
In theory,
not that he just keeps invading and dying.
In theory, in the Elise game, his lanes should have been winning at one point, but because he didn't go to them at all, and he ignored Contrax's presence or whatever, the lanes didn't go how they were supposed to, so he then invades. He's like, these should be winning matchups, right? Right? No, Forlan. That's not how this works. But it was a good time. I somewhat enjoyed my T1 versus Direwolves experience. I enjoyed Schernfire going bottom every single game after the first game, even if it didn't make any sense. That was a good time. So both of those junglers were a fun time. But yeah, it was I don't know. I think those games were fun. Yeah, I'll put it that way. Like, T1 is a fun team. They're not going to be the kind of team that I'm going to watch a lot. I think that there were a few interesting things. Or they actually, I think it was which was it Team 1 or Direwolves that did this? And I thought, oh, that's a cute use of Rift Herald. Yeah, it was Direwolves in the last official game that the two teams played, where Team 1, if they had back advantage, they could have been able to get ahead of them on Drake. So even though they knew the Rift Herald wasn't going to get the turret probably, they used the Rift Herald mid so that Team 1's bottom lane would have to stay mid and clear the Rift Herald and wouldn't be able to back like they wanted to. And so that way Direwolves could get advantage on the Infernal Drake play and get the Infernal Drake. And I thought, oh, that's creative. That's cute. I like that. So it's not like I think the games were just complete garbage, but I feel like there was. Do you agree with me in saying that there was a difference between like watching Lyon versus Gambit and T1 versus Direwolves?
Yes, I do. I think so with Gambit and Lyon, it came down to mistakes in execution and mistakes in setups in the games that they lost, right? Whereas Direwolves in 1, it was, I don't think these teams were thoughtless, right? Like, I think they have in their heads an idea of what they want to do for the most part, but it's kind of tossing back and forth how well they're executing it, and also just how well they're taking in everything else that's going on in the map. Like, a lot of times Team 1 did their patented, we're going to send one person to be our sacrificial Lamb while the rest of us are going to take a turret, which is something that they've done previously. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it was a very poor decision. We also saw a lot of, like, I don't feel like you'd see, so I'm going to pick on Forlan again, but we saw Surenfire do some questionable things in the jungle as well. There's a lot of, like, assumptions being made by certain players where, like, oh, you know, back, like, presumably back in Oceania or back in Brazil, like, we can totally do this because we're going to make the assumption our lanes are pushing, or we're going to make the assumption that we have vision here because we've pushed out a wave top or whatever. Mm-hmm. And without that, they didn't automatically adjust, whereas I do think we saw a lot more adjustment from Lyon and Gambit in terms of what was actually happening in the game versus what they were used to, if that makes any sense. Like, I do think there's a definite discrepancy between the two teams that weren't WE in Group A and the two teams that weren't C9 in Group B. I think this is definitely a step down in terms of gameplay.
And for me, I think what Marf brought to the table was just a general awareness of the fact that his jungle wasn't going to be mid, I think. I think the big disconnect for Bruiser was that he'd be pushed out and then he would get ganked by the Contracts Jensen duo, and he'd end up losing like 2 waves or something, and he'd still try to push out and get pressure, and his jungle wouldn't back him up. Marf, I felt like he played, like, Cassiopeia should be able to push okay into Corki anyway, but he still played the matchup really safe until, like, I think it was Galio top? Yeah, he had Galio top. He played safe until Galio had 6, Sejuani had 6, and he felt like he had better backup, and then he could play more aggressively in the lane. So I thought that was, like, those kinds of small touches were nice from Marf. But I don't necessarily think T1 are going to do well against any of the first C teams that we see.
Yeah, if Team 1, like, this is going to sound really mean, but just as someone who's pretty familiar with Team 1, if they actually make it out, I will be shocked. I will be very shocked.
Also
just
happy,
because,
you know, right?
Oh, I'll be super happy. Like, I'll be, like, crazy on Twitter if that happens. But, like, because I love these guys, and I want to see them succeed, and I'm actually super happy that they made it out of the group stage and play-in, because it was not looking good after day one. I thought, woof, like, what is... That draft against Direwolves is just, oof. The Jax one. But I think... Another thing that I really can't get out of my head is that a lot of these players are just mechanically outclassed. Sure. So when they go up against, like, say they're going up against Fnatic, they're going up against WE, like, I think you're going to see a lot of games that are really similar to C9 just because it's not even about them being able to come back and set up objective trades like they were against Direwolves because they were a lot more evenly matched mechanically. I think that's going to be a huge issue for this team going forward, regardless of whether they're able to improve in the week in terms of macro execution. So that's going to be, like, I will honestly be floored if this team makes it out.
So I think a lot of people are really high on Cloud9 after the play-in stage games because they looked like they had a lot better jungle mid coordination than we saw from them the last time and everything else. But do you feel like better about Cloud9? Are you kind of like me with WE and it's just like my attitude towards this team hasn't changed, you know?
My attitude towards C9 hasn't changed.
Okay.
I think, like I had said, so doing group previews, I'd said Fnatic was the team that, like, holy crap, if they don't make it out of this group, like, that's going to be really looking really poorly on that team, right? Mm-hmm. But with C9, it's, like, just a slight step from that. Like, I would have been really shocked if C9 didn't come out first in this group just because of what I knew of Direwolves and Team 1 going in. Like I said, those C9 Team 1 matchups went exactly as I expected, where they were just completely outclassed mechanically. I think if you do want to look at, because like I'm still not super high on C9. I know a lot of people are now saying like they're the best team in play-ins. This is great. They're performing really well. I still think they made a lot of mistakes. I think that game against Direwolves, where Direwolves went up really early, especially through all of those bot lane plays, I think that's something that C9 really need to look out for, even though obviously they were able to come back in that game. I didn't really think that they were ever going to lose that game because Direwolves weren't necessarily turning a lot of those advantages into objectives or even like forward vision. Mm-hmm. But I think that a team that can do that is obviously going to be pretty rough for C9. So while I think that it's kind of like you with WE, right? Where I think that C9 will definitely make it out of play-ins, for sure.
Yeah.
I don't think there are teams like looking at because they're going to play someone who makes it out in second, right? Group D is a little poof, but like whoever, KLG or Ascension, whichever one of those teams makes it out, or I guess can they still play Lyon the way the brackets are set up?
Yeah, I think so, right?
They draw them. Yeah, I would actually really like to see that set up too. Because I think Lyon could make them sweat. Even though I think C9 would eventually come out on top, I definitely think Lyon could make them sweat a lot.
I think
and that'd be a really interesting series for me actually, because I think Lyon's early game prowess is good. Like they're actually really smart about how they want to play the early game. And C9 still, like, when we saw Direwolves taking advantage of it, it was also because I think Contracts was pretty shaky on the jungle Ezreal.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe that's why he decided to bring it out against Direwolves, because, like, he knows that he'll have his team to back him up. It's, he can test it out in professional play. And it ended up working well late. But I think he did have a slightly rough start. And I think that would be something where we've already seen like Audi capitalize on that and be able to play the early game really well. So that would be a really interesting matchup to me, even though I do think C9 would still come out on top.
Yeah,
I think where they're going to have issues is once they get to the group stages.
I think I have some questions for C9 still. I feel a little bit better about them just because I felt like Contracts and Jensen were just so out of sync in the gauntlet that I felt better seeing them, even if they didn't do anything super complicated. They basically just double timed mid over and over again, and I felt like there was still issues with, like, they didn't do much with top side advantages when they had them. So there were still some issues with lane coordination, but I felt a little bit better about jungle mid just based on this. I think that we still see them going for objectives, not necessarily when they have the best control, but there was like one point in the first game I think they played where I just wrote, okay, they go to this Baron without setup, but they literally don't even have to back at this point because for items because the enemy team is so far behind. Like,
yeah,
there's not much you can criticize them too much for not having this Baron set up that properly. There was also one Baron setup where they just exposed the jungle, like they didn't have their jungler flanked well with support or anything like this, and so they killed the jungler, but it didn't matter because then they went mid and just won the fight 4v5 and went back to Baron. So it's super hard to judge them, but they're still making some of the same mistakes that we saw them make domestically. And I think that, for example, their bottom lanes seem to do poorly like every game, which was really surprising to me. Like Sneaky and, except for the first game, I think Sneaky and Smoothie did really well in the first game, but after that it was like bot lane was not, whether a winning matchup or losing matchup, they seemed to be playing their matchups poorly. They seemed really surprised by jungle pressure. And that's how Direwolves got an advantage, even though, like, I think Surenfire did the same path, like, 3 times in a row. And it's like, at a certain point, you're just, why is this tri-bush not warded, you know? So I think that that's an interesting thing to look out for as well. Blue ended up taking advantage of the fact that they were against Vladimir Sejuani in that game to get a lot of mid pressure that I don't think you would get if you draft like a better mid 2v2 on the enemy team, things like that. I don't know. There were just a lot of weird situations for Cloud9. Even when they snowballed a lot, there were gaps in how they were setting up. Like if they pushed really far forward, despite into multiple forms of long-range engage, and then the enemy team just seemed afraid to engage on them, even though they weren't that far behind or anything like this, just makes me still want to see more from Cloud9. I hope that whoever they face in a best of 5 next will give a better picture of what gaps are still missing for them. So,
yeah.
Both WE and Cloud9, I think, didn't surprise me too much. I feel better about Cloud9, about the same about WE. Okay.
Fair.
Do you have anything else you want to add?
Not about Group B. I did want to say I mistakenly said Ascension before. It's Young Generation.
Right.
I watched them play 2 very long best of 5s, and that's my mistake for saying the wrong team name. But either way, I'm not.
I didn't correct you either, so I'm culpable. Despite the fact that I also watched those 2 best of 5s. Now that
they were something else.
Yeah, it was fun. Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back after Group C and D.
Woo!